Hey there! I'm here on the campus of my old university where they filled my head with hot garbage to introduce the next installment of my video about creating interesting species for tabletop role-playing games. The Ysoki are on the menu, and in the last installment I introduced my kind of theory craft around how to create something interesting where there's cause and effect. Remember, this is an exploration of kind of how the features of a species that becomes starfaring are selected for. What are the environmental pressures that make being smart into something that gets evolved? And how does that make for an interesting game at the table? It doesn't mean that your game's not going to be beer and pretzels. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be an interesting tone of swashbuckling. There could very much be so. So have fun with this. And pay attention to the timeline as it advances. It's an analog to our own evolution. And if you don't believe in that sort of thing, this probably won't be of much use to you.
My idea for the Ysoki begins not with rat-like scavengers, but with something much more like the naked mole rat of our planet. Which is to say, a species that dwells in hives, with queens and workers in burrows. Now, how would a species like that take to life above ground? How would they become individual enough to become interesting player characters with wants and needs? Well, it's a long, strange trip. Let me get my notes out. Let's put one more disclaimer on this video before we get too far into depth. I'm publishing this video at a moment where Paizo hasn't revealed a great deal of the details about what the different races and their ecologies will be. But I am going to work off of the assumption that the iconic character for the Ysoki race is also a mechanic. And I'm going to take that and run with it. I'm not going to look too much at what they say about the Ysoki in People of the Stars, which is a supplement by Paizo, but instead I'm going to work from my own impressions of what this race looks like in the art. And I believe it may be the only race that has a different size category of small. Okay, so what is the pre-sentient ancestor of the Ysoki? For me, if you go way back, it's a browser like the possum. It's someone who's going out and scavenging carrion, eating berries, and generally trying to look after its babies. Maybe this particular species uses kind of matriarchal associations, a lot like elephants. Sisters go out together, taking care of their babies, and browsing for various sources of food. The grandmothers might be shepherds of lore. And from this matriarchy evolves into something where there's only one female that is fertile. Now at some point, this ancestor species that's a browser on the surface takes to a sedentary lifestyle. The pressures involved in getting fertility restricted to a single queen animal is not something that me as a non-biologist understands too well. But suffice it to say, at some point, living underground, these proto-Ysoki are fond of taking care of a very obese queen animal. She gives birth to very many offspring at once, she has a lot of mammaries, and those little babies are incubated over time. Perhaps they're given mashed food after a while, and these sibling groups become work units that go out and gather food to feed the fungus colonies and to just look for berries and nuts and other things that have always been a staple of this proto-Ysoki diet. What drives this species to start trying to get more smart? Well, for me, all of what we just discussed is taking place in a global cooling epoch. There's a land bridge to a smaller continent, something like Zealandia or Australia, and this cold epoch of history also leads to the Ysoki becoming bigger to conserve heat. And in spite of them being a burrowing animal, well, they just get bigger because it makes more sense in the cold climate. They have to get bigger claws and they have to get bigger mouths to continue to dig their tunnels in the colder and sometimes frozen ground. This is important because at some point I've got to get this species big enough that it works on an ordinary human-sized starship. So then the Ysoki's planet starts warming up again. Aridification happens, deserts are popping up, and this population of proto-Ysoki that's up there near the ice cap, well, they're isolated now because their land bridge is flooded. And any smaller populations tend to evolve more quickly because of random mutations and because they can get under evolutionary pressures that much faster. They can feel the pinch. So I mentioned that a big staple of this proto-Ysoki diet is a fungus colony that they cultivate either near their lair or inside of it. And I've been thinking that they need to gather various forest litter, maybe even caterpillars and other dead gunk, who knows. But these workers that go out in these work units, they start discovering that if they're able to perhaps carry more in their hands, then they can bring more back to the hive. And thus we get to an upright posture. These workers are able to stay out longer if they're able to browse for more food on their own, and so they start getting more flexible digits. Things like hands that allow them to eat bugs and pick up fruit and so on. And then something very interesting happens. They start to realize that as they're walking on two legs and they're carrying all this food back to the hive, that if only they could perhaps tie the food up in a bundle or build something like a basket, then they would be off to a great start. And thus we have the beginning of tool use. And perhaps cracking nuts with artifice gets on the menu next, and perhaps refrigeration or heating become things that are explored within the layer. Now we're getting into a caveman era for the Ysoki. Now I mentioned how this proto-Ysoki population is already in a bit of a tight spot. They're on a small continent, and anything bad that could happen could really affect them. Now, what happens next? A blight. The fungus species that these Ysoki are using, it falls victim to some sort of illness. And because they're so dependent on this particular flavor of food, well, it drives them to start really browsing again. It drives them to start looking for new sources of food. That said, they've probably lost the stomach for eating meat or carrion. Because they've been dwelling in hives together, they probably can't really do the whole thing where they eat rotting meat and then sleep right next to each other. It might be bad for their health. At least I'm surmising as much. Under this ecological pressure for food, there's competition between the hives. Queens go to war with one another for a particular stack of food. And also, if you can fortify your lair that much better, or place it in a uniquely defensible spot, then you're going to survive as a queen and do better. And so it begins that the Ysoki start exploring different ways of fortifying their lairs. Perhaps some take to building tree houses. It's a tough road to hoe, and perhaps some of these colonies are utter failures. But over time, flexibility begins to reign as far as where you build your lair and nurse your young. And it's probably here that construction begins, hollowing out logs, and perhaps making the entire colony float in a boat-like apparatus becomes something that queens order their workers to do. And as the specialization becomes more and more necessary, the various work units become clan-like. They become associations of knowledge, because the knowledge to do these things becomes more complex. And within the limited Ysoki lifetime, you can't teach a worker all the various skills that have been acquired. You have to pick and choose. And so the work units become more and more like guilds and families. And suddenly there's a pressure upon Ysoki society away from the hive model. Now there are groups that are not the hive. They're not just me and my queen, they are me and my profession. We want to take care of the little young workers that have been assigned to our work unit. It's a family growing out of this technological existence. It's going to get more exciting in a little bit. At this point, I surmise that food pressures are becoming that much more intense, and crossing the oceans to the other, perhaps more ecologically suitable continents of their world is off the menu because their queens are still totally immobile. And thus begins a brand new technology. There's been a little bit of experimenting with eating this feminizing agent that's in a berry. Now, if I drink a lot of beer, which I've been known to do on occasion, perhaps a season at a time, I will tell you that these get a little bit bigger. Now, I haven't really mentioned how it is that the queen is differentiated sexually from her workers. I've taken it to mean that there's just no puberty for anyone besides the queen, and perhaps a few select cadre of males. Perhaps in the very end of their life they go through a particular change chemically inside of them that allows them to become fertile. And so puberty is an end-of-life thing for males rather than a beginning-of-life thing. And just like a dairy farmer is wise to keep perhaps only one bull, this would limit the number of males. So here we have this interesting feminizing agent in the form of a berry that allows a female worker to become a queen by binging on it, or perhaps only to become partially fertile for one season by eating a few doses. This would allow Ysoki to kind of move into smaller family units. It could be that these work units that are shepherding the various knowledges that have been acquired by colonies decide to break off on their own using this technology. And this sudden change from a hive society to one that's also tribal could be very violent. However, for me it's much more interesting to think that there's a lot of back and forth, that even as these tribal societies emerge and there's kind of smaller groups getting out there, anytime a Ysoki female acquires enough power and consolidates it unto herself and has enough servitors and friends, perhaps she decides to burrow down and become a queen. Perhaps that's a deeply held instinctive impulse. Okay, now we are about 90% done fleshing out who the Ysoki are. But I want to play a male Ysoki in the prime of life. I don't want to play a prepubescent kind of worker Ysoki that's from this proto-Ysoki realm. Ysoki are going to have males and females, and they're going to seem a lot like the males and females of mammals on our world, but with this different backstory. How does that achieved? Well, after millennia of progression through technology, through Roman times and medieval times and into our time, masculinizing agents are also discovered. The male Ysoki, the workers, over time gain the same ability to acquire puberty before their lifespan is up. And yet there's a couple interesting dilemmas still resident in this possibly starfaring version of our Ysoki. Are they totally dependent on these pharmaceuticals to really gain gender and sex the way that we perceive them on our world? Well, the answer could be yes, as you formulate things, but I think a much less politically divisive answer is that sometime during the gap, or perhaps in recent times, the Ysoki have opted to go on a genetic modification campaign. They've opted to normalize what has become the norm anyway. People have been using these dietary supplements since the beginning of time to become male and female, and using their technological prowess, they've finally discovered the means to program this into their genome. But what about the queens? Did they ever die out? Are there still Queen Ysoki? I think so. I think that perhaps religious and ideological conflicts around the idea of the hive, and perhaps revivalism of hive thinking among the Ysoki, could be something that is thought of fondly, or sometimes unfondly. It's an ideological divide. Do we want to go back to the way we were, or do we want to embrace who we are now? Are female Ysoki perpetually tempted to sort of gather power and followers unto themselves, to create armies and to build fortresses so that they can settle down and become a queen? Well, that's an interesting question. And what about male Ysoki? How do they approach fertility? Do they look at it as something that they only do sometimes and they prefer to sort of stay in that non-pubescent state of infertility for most of their lives? Do they make it something that they can turn on and off? Are they scholars that sort of go into the monastery and sort of tune their craft, absent any of the distractions of mating? It's a totally different worldview, and yet when your Ysoki arrive first on camera in your game, nothing can be all that amiss. Perhaps it's a colony of Ysoki that have completely transformed their genome, and they're so willing to do this. They're so willing to do genetic modification because they've been doing it since the very beginning. It's been what made them into a civilization. They started eating some berries. So what do you think of my story of the proto-Ysoki into the starfaring Ysoki? Do you think it's something interesting? Do you think it adds color and flavor to an alien species? Does it make it more than just a furry suit, or a latex covering over the face like so many species in Star Trek? Is it too much? Does it make it too far into hard science fiction and no more science fantasy? How does magic relate to all this story that I just told you? After all, magic is such an important part of Starfinder. Well, those are questions that I hope to answer in the future, especially if this is a popular idea. I'm developing my ideas for Starfinder into a campaign setting that I call a broken sea of stars. One of the key features is that I'm going to enable, with my slightly different version of the drift drive that I will publish, something like a hex-crawling and exploring mode of play. Right now, the drift drive, as it's going to be published in Starfinder, makes Absalom Station the absolute center of the universe. 1-6 days there, no matter where you're coming from. And a completely fixed 5-6 days between opposite sides of the galaxy. And I think that that'll work great for the adventure paths and for society play. But I'm interested in something where something can be very far, and perhaps you can happen upon something along your journey, something unexpected, something that will be between two places the next time that you try and travel the same route. I'm hoping that it'll be something that's interesting for folks, and something that perhaps we can collaborate on. For now, I'm eagerly anticipating more and more of what we're seeing about Starfinder, and soon there's going to be a stream which will tell us perhaps most of the rules. And after that, I will be having a video. For now, I hope you enjoy your week. I'm the Complex Games of Pop.